Welcome back to Weekly Briefing. Joining me in studio is Christina Wong, Pentagon correspondent at Breitbart. Judge Matt O'Brien, Director of Investigations at the Immigration Reform Law Institute. And Dr. Shay Bradley Farrell, President of the Counterpoint Institute for Policy, Research, and Education. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi made history, becoming the first House Speaker since Newt Gingrich in '97 to visit Taiwan this week. China has heightened its aggressive rhetoric during the visit, but Pelosi was very supportive of Taiwanese democracy during this time. Christina, your take on the way that Speaker Pelosi drummed up the suspense going into this. She was very adamant about not really sharing whether she was going or not, and finally at the last minute she goes. What is your take?
Yeah, this was really a mess for the Biden administration because they publicly pushed back against her going, which made them look very weak and feckless against China. And Nancy Pelosi, her legacy is as a anti-Chinese Communist Party opponent, and so this was very important for her legacy to go, and so it made the Biden administration look bad. It was also
a clear rift between the leader of the Democrat Party on the legislative side and then the administration.
Exactly, and that's something Biden doesn't need. He already looks soft in China, lifting tariffs on Chinese-made solar panels, of course, the whole Hunter Biden scandal. Her trip was important to show that the CCP does not have a veto on American official travel, but at the same time, this was good politically for Pelosi because it distracts from her husband's issues and also with drunk driving and the stock investing.
It's also very confusing. For decades, the U.S. has had a strategically ambiguous position on Taiwan.
The One China policy.
Well, and I'm talking about the Taiwan Relations Act doesn't clearly say that we will intervene militarily, but we had Biden say that we would recently. The State Department has put out a statement, you can read it online, saying that they are not supporting Taiwan dependence or independence. If you go back almost a year ago, maybe not quite, the State Department was saying that we would. So it's very confusing. We've gone from a very strategic, ambiguous policy that was actually protecting us. Chinese didn't know what we were going to do. We didn't make a commitment to a very confusing foreign policy, or I don't even call it foreign policy, where the administration is contradicting each other. And I feel like Pelosi's trip to Taiwan is just more confusion.
Judge, I feel like in the background, when you have an administration, and you've worked in the administration from a legal point of view in past before, but it seems like if your policy on something as important as China or your stance on Taiwan is so confused, you can only imagine what the legal department looks like in the background.
I'm sure it's an absolute mess right now. I mean, the fact is, since 1972, when Nixon changed the China policy, it's been extremely unclear how we are proceeding with regard to Taiwan. And you can see it in our immigration policy. We're loading the country with Chinese students as China is actively engaging in all kinds of activities against the United States. Meanwhile, the number of Taiwanese that are coming here to study, which is something we should be encouraging, is relatively minimal. So I agree with the doctor, it's confusing, and I'm not sure the rest of the world knows what the United States is doing with regard to either of the Chinas.
No, that's a great point. President Joe Biden announced he will sign the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act into law Tuesday, August 9th. The bill includes more than $52 billion for U.S. companies producing computer chips, along with billions of other dollars funding research and development. Dr. Shay, what is going on here? How much money is actually pouring into this effort? I know it's an important one. We do need to start producing chips on U.S. soil. I mean, we were just talking about Taiwan. They produce about 90% of the world's microchips. And if China invades Taiwan, we're in a lot the trouble. So this is a needed bill, but there's something wrong with it.
That's exactly right. And that's why I'm of two minds about it, because the U.S. should not be dependent on other countries for major products. These chips go into iPhones, into military advanced equipment, among many other things. But it has a $280 billion total price tag on it. And we're in a recession right now because of reckless government spending. The U.S. has actually fallen to 25th place in terms of economic freedom around the world. That's a huge drop, and it is because our debt is growing. Taxpayers are going to bear the brunt of that. And I'm of the mind also, why is it our government that needs to choose which companies are going to be the ones to succeed on these chips? Why not incentivize the companies, give them more tax credits, and see who rises to the top in producing these?
Yeah, we've seen the disastrous outcome of countries in history who have decided to intervene in a very specific industry and start forcing the market to accept their product. So that is a great point. What chatter is there at the Pentagon about, so far, our lack of ability to actually produce these chips on our own terms?
Yeah, this is a problem. These chips go into a lot of our military equipment. We need them. I think the pandemic has shown that if we don't have our own manufacturing capability here at home, and we're reliant on China for things like Tylenol and other key critical ingredients, then we're in big trouble. So one thing that's positive about the bill is that it will help to bolster the semiconductor chip manufacturing here at home. Taiwan's top semiconductor chip manufacturing company plans to open a facility in Arizona, and with local labor, local American labor, to bolster that capability. So that's one positive thing, and I know the Taiwanese are very pro the CHIPS Act.
Mm-hmm. It seems like the supply chain discussion really didn't come into the forefront of our national security discourse until the pandemic, which is shocking for most of us who follow this. It seems like we would have had a better grasp of what our weaknesses were before 2 years ago.
Yeah, one would think, right? I mean, we're still facing lots of shortages with everything. I don't know if you've been to CVS recently, but we're still facing a tampon shortage.
Yeah, and formula and all kinds of
exactly.
basic goods and necessities.
Who would have ever thought,
shorted.
Here in America, we'd be facing these kinds of shortages? I mean, this is not necessarily related to China, but with eggs and meat and all sorts of things. I mean, it's kind of a shock, and I think it really wakes us up to what sort of shortages we could face, if given any kind of global, epidemic or issue.
And that's one of the problems with this act. I mean, I think the Chinese still control the rare earth mineral market, which is essential to manufacturing chips. So you can boost the U.S. economy, U.S. companies' abilities to fund chip manufacture, but if you can't get the raw materials to make the chips, you have a problem. And then I question whether this is just another large wealth transfer to China, because a lot of the companies in the United States that would be manufacturing chips are controlled by Chinese investors. Even though they probably shouldn't be. And the EB-5 investment program that allows Chinese to essentially buy lawful permanent resident status has a huge tech component with Chinese companies funded by the Chinese military and intelligence services that are pumping money into the U.S. economy to try and gain control of critical sectors like chip manufacture.
And those business visas, too, that you just mentioned are often bankrolled by the CCP itself. Nothing goes unnoticed by that government, especially if it has to do with the United States. Next topic. The Senate voted Tuesday night to pass a bipartisan bill which lengthens health care benefits for veterans exposed to toxic burn pits during their military service. The Senate voted and there was some controversy leading up into this vote. At first, the Republicans opposed it. They did not allow it to pass, and then an amendment was moved around, and then they voted for it. Christina, can you give us an update?
So I'm sure the doctor is very familiar with this, what happened, but essentially the bill, which was sold as a bill to expand benefits for veterans facing toxic exposure, which is a very, very important issue because there's been thousands of military veterans who've been exposed to chemical substances during their service in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially with these burn pits, burning all sorts of chemicals and all sorts of materials. They come back home, they suffer from cancer and other
these very
terminal,
rare cancers.
Exactly,
yes.
Other terminal illnesses, and that's something that I have covered very closely. And so Democrats sort of used this vehicle, but they inserted this budgetary gimmick in the bill that would essentially give them a gap of 400, I believe it's billion, to allow them to basically shift spending from discretionary to mandatory and give themselves that room to spend on other stuff. Yeah. So Republicans really oppose this.
So they included a blank check, essentially.
Exactly. Okay. But they used it, but after the Republicans, who I've spoken to some aides, they just got their act together too late. They couldn't muster opposition to it early enough, so it came as a shock. They weren't able to explain themselves, and of course, Democrats use this to make it seem like, oh, Republicans were against veterans who have, who
no, they did. They capitalized on that very hard all week.
And that's why Toomey had the amendment that he proposed. But here's something very important for people at home to understand. If you work in policy, you see this all of the time. Both sides of the aisle, especially the Democrats, are trying to constantly get other things funded through bills that have nothing to do with what they're trying to get funded. So that is why it is very important to actually read the bills and find out where funding is going to. Abortion is a huge issue on this, where Democrats are constantly trying to fund abortion organizations domestically and overseas through other bills. So if you don't actually read the bills, you don't know what's going on.
No, that seemed to be a perfect example of one of those bills where the top line headline looked horrible. It looked like Republicans were opposed to helping veterans
all the time,
when there was a little bit more nuance behind all of it.
And they name bills something that you're like, yeah, like the Equality Act, and then you find out not so good,
or the Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't actually reduce inflation. When we return, Biden tips his hand on the left's Hail Mary play for the November general election. But is it too little, too late? We'll be right back. President Joe Biden has gone all in on abortion. Biden signed an executive order aimed at helping Americans cross state lines for abortions. This comes after voters in Kansas overwhelmingly voted no to an amendment which would have allowed the state legislature to ban the procedure. Dr. Shea, talk to us about Biden's latest, I think this is his second executive order to try and bypass the Roe v. Wade overturning this summer.
That's right.
What ramifications does this move have?
Well, this is another indication of the Biden administration being extremely radical when it comes to abortion. No more safe, legal, rare, but all the way up until birth, sometimes after birth, on demand, taxpayers must pay for it. And I'd like to know what the judge thinks about this. But in my way of thinking, this violates the Hyde Amendment, which says that American taxes will not go towards funding abortion. Biden also reversed something that Trump had put back in place that makes American taxpayers not fund abortion organizations overseas. So we're back to doing that again. This is just, like I said, another indication of their extreme abortion agenda, and it's really bothering me. And again, also I'd like him to weigh in on this. But I would like to say to the Biden administration and their cohorts who continually say that the Supreme Court reversing Roe v. Wade threw down, abolished, destroyed a constitutional right. No, the reason they reversed it is because it clearly was not a right given to begin with. Us in the Constitution.
Judge, just this week we had the White House press secretary claim that the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade was itself unconstitutional. Your thoughts on that statement?
Well, I mean, that's sort of a bizarre claim because we live in a constitutional republic with 3 defined branches. If the judiciary, which is the final pronouncement on whether something is constitutional, has determined that it's not constitutional, then it's not. I agree. I do think it's a violation of the various provisions that prohibit taxpayer monies being spent on abortions. But I think even more important than that, this is when you have an administration that's willing to ignore the national border and national sovereignty, that doesn't bode well for a federalist system because, as you can see with these particular measures, now state borders don't seem to mean anything. And the primary significance of this decision was that this was being returned to the states under a federalist system where the decision belongs.
Right.
Christina, is this their Hail Mary to get the Democrats to coalesce and rally around the midterms?
It's like you read my mind, because that is exactly what I was going to say. Biden really has nothing else. The economy is in shambles. We just entered a recession, technically speaking, even though they're trying to redefine what recession means. There's nothing else that Democrats can run on. And so Biden is trying to drum up support with the liberal voters and the progressive voters with, this Inflation Reduction Act, the climate change bill.
It seems like the last two factions he is catering to are the abortion wing of his party and the very radical climate change agenda that he's trying to push through. I think those are the two factions left.
Absolutely, because they're the most politically dangerous for him. They're, without them, what does he have? So he's got to activate them.
I don't know if you agree with that, because I don't believe that the average Democrat is as extreme on abortion as they are. And I know for a fact that Democrats and Republicans, pro-life or pro-abortion, 80% of all of those do not want to pay for abortion access or services.
Certainly it seems to be that they're confusing their base, and that'll be a fatal mistake going into midterms. A report from the Center for Immigration Studies show that immigrants are finding easier ways to travel into Texas. Panama has reportedly shortened the Darien Gap route, and Mexico amended a policy of using National Guard roadblocks to slow immigrants en route to the U.S. at the Guatemala border. Judge, this is your area. What is happening now? They're removing provisions, they're putting provisions back. You see a lot of back and forth with this administration. Really, I think they're seeming a little bit confused about what to do about the southern border, while at the same time wanting to aggravate it.
Well, I think this is a perfect example of where domestic policy and foreign policy come together in immigration, and they do that more significantly in immigration than anywhere else. What the Trump administration figured out is that Mexico is one of our largest trading partners, and most of the countries in Central and South America are dependent upon the U.S. to a greater or lesser degree. So the Trump administration took a diplomatic approach and negotiated with those countries in order to get them to stop allowing people to either leave or transit their neighboring countries in order to get to the U.S. And clearly the Biden administration has an interest in not pursuing those policies, so it has reversed them. And what you're seeing is what happens when an administration that doesn't care about the law and that doesn't believe in borders is turned loose to undo what prior administrations had done so successfully.
But what our friend Todd Bensman writes in this article is that you have the governments of Central America really creating safer routes for migrants to move from South America into our southern border. And by creating these safer routes around the Darien Gap and so forth, they're really incentivizing more migration.
Sure.
I'm sorry, Judge, go ahead.
No, that's okay. It's because we're incentivizing it. And those countries have an interest in making sure that their closer neighbors, citizens, are not hurt or killed in the process of making the trip. But the Biden administration is sending a clear message to everyone outside of the United States. Come here, and as long as you can say the magic words and get across the border, you will be allowed to stay.
Contagious policy.
They're listening to our message now. I mean, that's the irony of it. So over a year ago, one of my investigations down on the border, I was talking to law enforcement, and a federal law enforcement agent in particular told me that the Biden administration has told us that we cannot keep hold of, we have to let people go that we have apprehended, even if they are a violent criminal felon, as long as they're not a terrorist. And I thought, really? Oh, come on, this isn't. We are finding out the things that we learned are really true. Last year, we had 4 times the amount of violent criminal felons come across than we did the year before. Something like 20 times the amount of murderers, for example.
And now, even the terrorist watch list is also growing, even though that is a specific area that we are explicitly told to eject out of our borders.
There's something like 120 different countries, citizens who've come through the border. We don't know who's coming through the border.
That's right. And actually, the judge and I, both of our organizations are part of a border coalition that is encouraging the next Congress. We want to work with them to do a bill that will close the loopholes on this mass illegal immigration.
Effectively, what's happened here is the U.S. government has become the most sophisticated and well-funded alien smuggler in the world, and that's frightening.
Yeah, no, that's a sad way to put it, but I think that's accurate. And to your point, Judge, too, you've also talked about how so much of this is being done on purpose by this administration. At some point, they'll wake up and realize the people they're bringing in do not align with their own values and may turn against them.
Well, what's funny also is that once I think Abbott threatened to bus migrants to D.C., then you had the mayor of, or they're here. I don't know if they're here or not.
Yeah.
But then you had D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser threatened to activate the National Guard, 4,000 National Guard indefinitely. So all of a sudden, they're a threat, you know.
In the sanctuary city where they were invited to come.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
What happened to sanctuary cities? I think that might be a discussion for another time, but sanctuary cities have suddenly become a very forgotten term, and I think they might actually bring it back. Panelists, the time has gone by. We are all done for this segment. Thank you so much for joining us.